University, Kobe University, and Hiroshima universities. And from Hiroshima University, Hotta Sensei kindly joining us. He's a vice president at Hiroshima universities. So that is sort of our histories. And Kobe University currently, nearly 50% of the students are international students. We teach in English, we teach in Japanese. So the student can get degree in English and also in Japanese. Our students coming from the government agencies, academia, and they go back to our international students especially, go back to their countries, and they serve, they have really key positions. Like, for instance, Vice Minister of the Ministry of Economy in the Kyrgyz republics, Senior Advisor to Prime Minister in Uganda. And the deans at Makerere universities, and the dean at the National University of Laos. So that our students are really doing well. And of course, that we also, our graduates working for international organizations like World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, OECDs. And among the Japanese at the World Bank education areas, 20% of the Japanese there, 20% of education experts at World Bank are Kobe University graduates in Washington, D.C. So we do have big presence there. So regarding international corporations and development, as a graduate schools, we actually, for 9 years, we did the trainings. We invited Ministry of Education officers to Kobe University. And then those Ministry of Education officers from Africa, Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, they came here and stay in Kobe for 6 weeks. We provided trainings. Topic is education, finance, and administrations. And they went back to the countries, and some became like a Director General, Cambodia Ministry of Education, or even the advisor from the Mauritania Ministry of Education came here to receive the trainings. We did that for 9 years in English and in French. So more than 200 students, more than 200 participants that they came actually, total. Not only that, today we are going to cover that education's the school autonomy and the school accountabilities. We sort of went for the JICS technical assistant project, and we won the biddings. So we do have such an experience. Then Gita Sensei came to Kobe University as a visiting professor, and her focus is education borrowing, education transferings. And then I asked Gita Sensei that, can we have that symposium? And she said yes. And I didn't know it's become so big conference we are able to do. I'm so happy for that. But I want to really thanks for that all our co-organizers and then our co-sponsors with your support. Thank you so much indeed. And also our keynote speakers and also the panelists. I will introduce them later. But I'd like to invite our co-organizers, who is the Dr. Ashley Tawey. She is the senior advisor in the KIX EMAP Hub with a particular focus on Asia Pacific regions. Dr. Tawey is a theme lead for the private sector approach at NORAC. She launched and direct NORAC's work in innovative financial education, including multi-year research project and the executive education programs on the topics offered by Geneva Graduate Institute. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Tawey. Thank you so much, everybody, for participations.
Thank you, Dr. Ogawa. Welcome, everyone, to this fantastic symposium today. Before I introduce the symposium and all of our partners and speakers, I would actually first like to pass the platform on to our technical staff. They need to give some technical introductions for all of our participants joining online. I think we have close to 200 people joining online beyond everyone in the room. So can I give the floor to Annika here, please?
Thank you, Arushi. Hi everyone, and welcome to this hybrid symposium. My name is Annika Harish Ganesh, and I'm a project officer with the KIX EMAP Hub. I'm going to quickly give a technical introduction to everyone before I pass the floor back to Arushi. So firstly and importantly, we have language interpretation available in 3 languages, Arabic, Russian, and Khmer. If you would like to listen to the speeches in any of these languages, please make sure you go to the interpretation button as shown in the slide here, and you choose the language that you prefer to listen to the talks in. And if your preferred language is Khmer, please note that it will be displayed as Spanish, not Khmer. So please choose the Spanish option if you would like to listen to everything in Khmer. Please also note that if you're going to be speaking in one of these languages, make sure that you're in that channel. So if you're speaking in Russian, please stay in the Russian channel while you're speaking in Russian so that the interpreters can translate it into the other languages. Thank you. So because of the large room size, the microphones are switched off, but please do keep your camera switched on if possible, as it's friendlier. And we are recording this event, and the recording will be made publicly available after the session's over. And as I mentioned, language interpretation is available. Please rename yourself in the participants window with your first name and last name, and also introduce yourself in the chat with your first name, last name, your country and organization. In case of any issues, please write to us using the chat function. We have Q&A sessions during this symposium. Please ask your questions in the chat at any time during the session, and we'll group them together and address them all during the Q&A sessions. And when you do ask a question, please make sure to mention your first name, your last name, your country, and organization as well. Lastly, please follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter at KIX EMAP. And if you are going to be tweeting about this event, please use the hashtag KIX EMAP or hashtag GPAKIX. Now I'll hand over the floor back to Arushi. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. I hope for the online audience, you have all by now selected the language of your preference. For this event, we will be simultaneously translating everything. So welcome, everyone. We are very excited to welcome you to this Education Reform Symposium. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Hub, which is managed by NORAG. I'm welcoming you today in place of our Hub Director, Jose Luis Canellas, that most of you are more familiar with seeing in these events. He was not able to join us because of the time difference today. A little bit of a background on the KIX EMAP Hub itself. The Knowledge and Innovation Exchange Initiative is a joint endeavor between Global Partnership for Education, GPE, and the International Development Research Center, IDRC. And the regional hub of Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific is managed by NORAG at Geneva. I'm representing both KIX EMAP Hub and NORAG here as a senior technical advisor. NORAG and the KIX EMAP Hub share a common mission to produce, surface, amplify, and disseminate knowledge on education from the Global South. We bring diverse actors and perspectives to the table to discuss critical and underrepresented topics in education development. Today for this symposium, we are very excited to partner up with Kobe University, Teachers College Columbia University, UNESCO Chair at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and also our numerous co-sponsors, especially from the KIX EMAP countries and partners like the Ministry of Education, Youth, and Sports in Cambodia, United Nations University, Waseda University, and University of Toronto. This particular symposium provides us a great opportunity to look at the trends in education reforms across the world and that are particularly supported by development partners. We will start with 2 keynote speeches. The first keynote speak will be given by Dr. Rie Kajima on this database, an impressive database that she has developed with her colleague, Dr. Patricia Bromley, which looks at education policies from 189 countries and territories. Dr. Bromley is not going to be able to join us today because of the time difference. However, Dr. Kojima will present some early findings from the analysis of this database. Dr. Kojima is an assistant professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at University of Toronto. She has extensive experience working with global institutions, researching topics like international assessments, STEAM education, and global trends and impacts of education reforms. After her first presentation, Dr. Gita Steiner-Kamsi will discuss the variations and changes over time in global education reforms that are supported by development partners. Dr. Steiner-Kamsi is professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, and is also the honorary UNESCO Chair in Comparative Education Policy at the Geneva Graduate Institute. She is the leading scholar on global policy transfers and conducts research on global governance in education, comparative methodology, and teacher policy. After these two presentations, we will open up the floor to take questions from audience attending online and in person within the room. And then we will move on to the second part, which is a discussion with global experts. For audience who is attending online, please feel free to use the chat function throughout the sessions to put your questions in. And as Annika said, please do mention your name and organization when you're asking the questions. We will combine some of these questions to put to the speakers after the first set of keynote speeches. And then again, we will have a longer discussion session after the second discussion, panel discussion. Thank you very much. With that, I will pass on the floor to Dr. Kojima.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Terue, for this kind introduction. And I'd like to share a little bit about the work that we are doing. My name is Rie Kijima, and I'm an assistant professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Keiichi Ogawa Sensei for the invitation to participate in the symposium today. It really is an honor to be here. Professor Ogawa and I worked at the World Bank many years ago, and I'm really honored to receive this invitation to participate in the symposium. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Gita Steiner-Kamsi for her guidance and inspiration. Our relationship goes back many years when I was a master's student at Stanford University when Professor Steiner-Kamsi was a visiting professor who taught a course in international comparative education at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. So it's wonderful. It's full circle to be back here to be invited to this wonderful symposium and to share a little bit more about our work. Now, today I'd like to speak about the project that my co-principal investigator, Professor Patricia Bromley of Stanford University, and I have been working on. If you allow me, I'd like to share a little bit of a story of how this project came to fruition. The initial exchange of ideas happened around 2017 when Professor Bromley and I were both at Stanford. We were looking for different ways to develop some sort of database related to education reforms. And I was looking for something that perhaps maybe I could develop for my research, but I couldn't find anything that related to cross-national database on education reform. So I reached out to Professor Bromley and asked if she was interested in collecting data on education reforms and whether we could work on this project together, given her expertise in organizational theory, content analysis using national curricula, and her interest more broadly on issues related to globalization of education. So this gave rise to this research project, which has developed and expanded over many years, both in terms of scope and purpose. So if you could go to the next slide, please, that'd be wonderful. Today, I'll center our discussion around this World Education Reform database. Next slide, please. We've been developing a novel database that consists of national education reforms from different countries around the world. More recently, we've started to publicly release our database so that more scholars can use, or more education policymakers can use this database to advance work related to education policy. So the very first version of the database, which we developed around 2020, had approximately 8,000 reforms. At the end of 2023, we released the second version of this database, which now consists of 10,000 reforms. And this is actually the version you'll find on Harvard's Dataverse. So it's publicly available and you can download it. Anyone can download it to take a look at our database. Now, very soon, we'll be releasing the third edition, or the third version of this database, which consists of 15,000 education reforms. Next slide, please. And we have collected reform data from 219 countries and territories. The country that has the largest number of education reforms is from the UK, with 286 reforms, which is equivalent to 1.9% of the total number of reforms that are found in our database. We have a wide global coverage, as you can see from this figure, with the largest number of reforms represented in darker shades of blue. Next slide, please. Now, in order to go through this process systematically, we decided to collect data from different documents published by international organizations, such as UNESCO, the World Bank, OECD. And there are two reasons why we decided to take this approach to look at documents published by these international organizations. First, national policies and reforms can be found in documents published by each government. But the process of finding national documents can be quite time-consuming and oftentimes quite idiosyncratic in nature. We were able to collect reform measures from a larger number of countries, given that member states and countries of international organizations are mandated to publish national education reports on a regular basis. So we could take advantage of the fact that there will be national reports across different countries and different regions. We also include data drawn from International Encyclopedia of Education as a way to collect data from experts who have contributed to various editions of this particular encyclopedia. Next slide, please. Now, this is an example of a reform measure taken from a report produced by an international organization. We extract the actual description of the reform, the year it was articulated, and the title of the reform. So you can see here that this reform is sort of what we might see in a particular report. And we try to extract those three information in order to create a database that consists of 10,000 or 15,000 reforms. Next slide, please. And we spent, at the very beginning of our research, approximately about a year just refining the definition of education reforms. During this process, we worked very closely with coders, or there are research assistants who went through various documents produced by international organizations. We wanted a systematic, a reliable, and methodical way to identify reform measures from documents. And so we settled with a standardized definition of reform, which consists of three parts. First, a reform is planned. It's an intentional act rather than an unplanned change, such as perhaps disasters or response to disasters, demographic shifts, or personnel shifts. And the second characteristic of a reform, that it is non-routine. It depicts change, something new, something different, rather than routine changes like annual budget approval or regular hiring and firing of teachers, personnel who are part of the education system. And the third component is that reform should be systemic, that it involves collective administration of a policy. It can be incremental change, or it could be a large-scale paradigm change. So those three components really helped us define what a reform is, and that we're able to collect this data from various documents that we looked at. Next slide, please. The application of this database has really infinite possibilities. We observed 4 different strands of research that have emerged from the World Education Reform Database. And these are, first of all, right, looking at the amount of reform and what causes variations of reforms. So one of the papers that we wrote as a team is looking at the number of reforms over time. The second strand of research relates to types of reforms and causes of reforms. Here, we have scholars like Professor Gerald Letendre and his team and his colleagues have looked into our database and looked at trends in teacher policies and reforms. A Stanford doctoral student, Minju Choi, has a paper on human rights and human capital. Another doctoral student at Stanford, Jiang Sung, is looking at factors associated with countries that articulate reforms that focus on marginalized children and youth. We have doctoral students at Kobe University, Kohei Uno, Ayumi Yagi, and Professor Steiner Kazmi are working on a paper on governance, accountability, and transparency using our Word database. There are also research that focus on consequences or impact of education reforms. We look at implications of access reforms and do they actually improve enrollment rates? We also take a look at the association between quality-focused reforms on learning outcomes. These are some questions that I think many education policymakers are quite interested in understanding whether reform really has those impact or consequences on various educational outcomes. And the fourth strand of research that's really come out more recently focus on the interactions between global and local levels. So we have drawn great inspiration from Professor Gita Steiner-Kazmi's work on reforms in countries like Iceland and Switzerland. We're looking at a case study of Japan. So thinking about how we can utilize this data to apply to more national context. Next slide, please. The Word database has provided us with an opportunity to answer research questions that were previously difficult to tackle because of this lack of information across national longitudinal data on national education reforms. And it's been incredible to be able to develop more research and be able to answer some of these questions that we've been all grappling with. And today I'd like to highlight 6 key findings we have found so far using our database. First, education reforms have declined over time. And we think that this is due to the backlash against neoliberal education policies. Second, the number of quality-focused reforms have risen, while access-focused reforms have declined. Third, there's a decline in reforms in recent decades with changing influence of global organization actors. So for many decades, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, the World Bank played a central role in enacting, facilitating, supporting reform efforts. We observe a strong correlation between World Bank lending in education and reform efforts. However, over time, we find that the World Bank is less associated with reform efforts. This is not to say that the influence of the World Bank has declined, but their direct effect in affecting reforms have perhaps diminished over time. On the other hand, there is an increase in the presence of international or non-governmental organizations in enacting reforms. So using the theory that's been developed by many scholars in international comparative education, we understand that perhaps maybe this could be because of the growing criticism towards the World Bank, and the World Bank are partnering with these international non-governmental organizations to enact, support, and trigger policy changes. So we see some of that dynamic change, and we observe some of those findings in our analysis. Fourth, countries that articulate human rights discourses are more likely to adopt human capital discourses or reforms with economic rationales. So we see a little bit of that convergence happening in various articulation of reforms. Fifth, we see this interesting phenomena where data and information reforms have increased due to the rise in datafication of knowledge. And I'll share a little bit more our finding in our next slides. Sixth, the articulation of quality reforms are associated with learning outcomes. So we see some countries articulating reforms related to quality. And does that actually improve learning outcomes? And our preliminary findings suggest that it does. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'll share two sets of figures that represent some of our key findings. And this first figure is from our article, which was published in Sociology of Education. Now you can see here that there is a decline in education reforms over time, especially after the global financial crisis that happened between 2007 and 2008. And there's a rapid decline in reform efforts starting around that time, as you see the number of reforms peak around 2006, 2007, and then it drops dramatically afterwards. So that's been one of the biggest findings that has come out of our research. Next slide, please. The second set of figures uses topic modeling, which is an inductive way to extract themes and ideas based on texts or associations of words in our database. So we observe that there is a decline in rights-based access and inclusion reforms, which is very much consistent with what Lisa Overbay, Minju Choi have found on reforms that are focusing on these access-related or human rights type reforms as the system of education expand over time. So you see that decline in the figure on the left-hand side. On the right side of this slide, you see that there is actually a rise in reforms that are categorized as data and information systems, which relate to reforms that are associated with assessments, monitoring and evaluation, measurement, and information systems. So while certain types of reforms have declined, we also see that some types of reform, like data-driven management and organization, has increased over time. We also acknowledge that perhaps maybe some of this expansion of our database to more recent years, so post-COVID years, will enable us to capture this rise of artificial intelligence among reforms related to data and information systems. So it's an avenue of further research. Next slide, please. There are many usages of our database, and we can highlight some strengths of this particular database. There's a wide geographic and longitudinal coverage. We are continuing to collect data And our priority now is to expand the database to the 1960s, prior to the 1970s, to understand the change in patterns of global governance and education post-World War II. We also hope to expand, as I mentioned earlier, to years post-COVID, so that we can see some of these changes in rhetoric or in discourse after many schoolings and students were having to learn online. We use a standardized definition of reform, and the reforms are tested for inter-rater reliability. So we spent quite a bit of time making sure that the reforms that we're collecting are systematic over multiple sets of documents. And there are many types of reforms that appear in our database, which makes it quite easy for scholars and policymakers to be able to use part of our database that are of interest to them, whether that is specifically on early childhood education or secondary education, or even on topics related to finances of education. It also offers insights into globally legitimate narratives and discourses, so we can see what countries are articulating and how that has changed over time. And one of the other strength that we have, I think it related to this research, is that we're able to expand and augment the database by finding more documents and reports to create a robust database. And so what we're trying to do here is to continue developing versions 4, versions 5, so that we can be as comprehensive as possible in the construct of our database. Next slide, please. So here are some of the limitations of our database. They're like in any research or limitations. And one of the things that we want to mention is that it's not a representative sample or a whole population of reform. We're extracting information from international organizations or documents published by international organizations. So that limits the kinds of reforms that are articulated that we're able to extract from documents. Also, there's no measure of size or scale of reform. We weren't able to gather all of that information about how much the reform cost for certain countries or the scale of these reforms. It also does not represent the nature or the extent of domestic discourse. And in that we need to gather more extensive information at the national level. But because our database is cross-national, this database really captures reforms that are intended for an international audience. We also think that national reporting process undercounts local levels of reform. So it's really a subset of various reforms that a country might articulate over a period of time. Next slide, please. Now, here are some current and future directions. We plan to continue identifying and coding reforms. That will continue to do so, as I mentioned earlier, to really develop a comprehensive database going forward, as we have been doing. But it takes quite a bit of time and effort, and we want to make sure that we have as much information as possible to get a really accurate perspective and understanding of how these reforms are articulated by different organizations as well as different countries. We're also embarking on a new collaboration with places like International Bureau of Education, at UNESCO to code historical reports, really dating back in time to the 1920s. It's something that we want to continue to do. We also want to explore partnerships for country case studies for country level analysis. We've been conducting a lot of research to understand cross-national comparisons, but I think it'll be really wonderful to be able to go deeper into each country case analysis. We'd also like to explore ways to develop a dynamic data visualization for easier kind of understanding of what our database presents and possible usages of data for global and national policymakers for greater policy impact. And I think that is an aspiration that we have, is to utilize this database, not just for research purposes, but also to have a greater policy impact, both at the national and at the international scale. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge all the people, the students, and the team that really helps us move forward with this research. We have two postdoctoral scholars, Jared Furuta, Lisa Overbay, and many doctoral students at Stanford University, Minju Tom, Aitor, Jiang, and Marsha. And we rely a lot on our wonderful undergraduate students at the University of Toronto and Stanford University, who go through extensive training with us so that they help us identify these reforms. And our research has been funded and supported by the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto, Stanford Graduate School of Education. And part of our research is also funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which is a Canadian federal research funding agency. So we are continuing our effort, and we hope that we'll be able to release the newest version of the database with you. And with that, thank you so much for your time and for listening. And I would love to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Ria Kijima. It was really wonderful to hear your presentation. It is a huge gift, this World Education Reform Database. We will, live on it professionally, use it for the next decade, especially because it keeps growing. And the class that I've been honored to teach, thanks to my wonderful host, Professor Keiji Ogawa, we started to develop 10 case studies already as part of their assignments. So, and it was a big deal of enthusiasm looking into the country. So what the students did at Kobe is what they call, like the Myanmar group, they call it Word Plus. They complemented the Word database with documents that were perhaps missing, or the summaries were not complete. So there is a feedback system in place, hopefully, where we can get back. So what the Word database really shows, and this is what inspired me to even look into it, was the database. It looks at global trends, and this is really a new way of looking at comparative policy studies. What I'm trying to do today is try to describe that global script, or the global trends that show up in the database, but also show up in the literature, in the review of literature, and then a little bit look at national encounters with this global script. And this is actually, because I'm more qualitative comparative policy studies, this is actually my contribution, because I'm not a quant person, as we say. Let me move on and show you give you the overview of the kind of things I would like to cover. One question is, what is even a global script? What does it stand for? That's a term that actually, I think the Stanford colleagues use, the neo-institutionalists use the word script. So I would like to illustrate how we could translate that in a language that also colleagues in international cooperation can work with. And then I would like to break down this script, or this reform package, or this reform wave, where that Ria Kijima showed, into three aspects: the theory of change that it had, then the bundle of policies, and the policy instruments. And I'm talking especially about this reform era, 1988 to 2008, because that's the reform, remember, where there were a lot of reforms happening. Some colleagues call it neoliberal script, and I think this is an accurate description because it started under neoliberal conservative governments. However, it ended up with democratic governments, with the Blair administration and Clinton administration and other Democrats. So that's why I think the neoliberal term does not quite apply, and it's better to call it, describe it in terms of what it did and what it believed in. And the policy goal of that reform era was first autonomy and decentralization, and then after a while it was accountability. So that's why colleagues such as Anthony Verger in Barcelona and his associates, they call it school autonomy with accountability, under the condition of accountability. So, and I call it SAVA. It's just a short form for school autonomy with accountability. So let me tell you first what I think what it was composed of, and then let's go to the national level, then national encounter with this global script, and then at the end, a few things that would be interesting to look into more depth at the very end. So systems thinking and global script. Let me just bring you two positive examples, interesting examples I worked with. I worked a lot in Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan, and I was very happy to see that we have colleagues both from Mongolia, Sanpatskano, and from Kyrgyzstan, Privet, here in the online session. And maybe we have a discussion even of projects that took care. An example of a good, interesting reform was this READ project. It was it was a World Bank project. It's an old project, and it was then implemented by the Mongolian Education Alliance. It was a wonderful project for the following reason. It really had a very clear, what I would call, theory of change. And the theory of change and the rationale and the goal was to say, if you, many countries have problems with school books and textbooks and reading material for students. The rationale they had was to say, that was the World Bank rationale, if you just give a few copies to rural schools, those books end up in the drawer of the teacher or with the school principal. And especially in Mongolia at the time, if teachers were held responsible, if anything would happen to books, their salary would be deducted. So because of that, what the World Bank did in that project, and it was a rural development project, they flooded primary schools with books, flooded many, many, many books. And at the same time, they encouraged students to take care of the books. They showed them how to bind them, how to take care of them. They showed students, and they involved parents. They involved parents to show parents how students can write their own books, but also how parents can read with the children. Then they also involved the librarian to take care of the books and to give a choice to children. So overall, it was really well thought out project because it had a really good theory of change and very good instruments how to sustain that change, because the idea was to encourage students for reading and writing. That was at that time already a priority, but also to encourage parental involvement and involvement of school libraries. It also had a side agenda, which was at that time just beginning when the World Bank started to encourage and funded actually countries to participate. So that was the side agenda, which I had the issue with because it was an unspoken side agenda to develop, standardized tests and primary school level in Mongolia. Nevertheless, it was really a great project. And what was then, after a while, when the project was finished, and I was one of the consultants on that project, there was a lot of reporting going on. And we had to report basically on 82 indicators, mostly output indicators, very few outcomes indicators. And at the end, somehow we lost sight of what the theory of change was, because there was so much reporting going on. And I think this is happening a lot actually in international cooperation, that it becomes so granular, it becomes so detailed, so itemized, that the bigger picture gets lost. Another example of a theory of change and instruments of change that was very interesting I worked with was an ADB project in Mongolia. It was as part of the poverty reduction project right after the economic crisis. It was no, actually, it was the ADB project, and there it already had elements of what I would call school autonomy with accountability. So we were just implementing agency. We did not design the project, but basically, and I found this kind of project in other places also. Donors like to give funds directly to schools because this way there's no financial leakage. It empowers schools. It gets to the people who really do education and teach, right? So they link it, however, with establishment of school boards. They link it with school development plans, and they link it with the strengthened decentralization as a result. And the outcome is to strengthen school-based financial management. So this is, again, it's using grants as a policy instrument, we would say, in policy studies, grants as a policy instrument to advance school autonomy with accountability at the school level, because it strengthens school management, financial management at school level, and at the same time gives demand side accountability, because the school boards are supposed to control how the money is being spent. These are just two examples to start the conversation about the, global script and what it entailed. So when you put all these elements together, the kind of projects that are being promoted by donors, but also what the literature says on what is really school autonomy and what is school accountability, you can tentatively come, and it's just an attempt to this kind of model. So each concept has its own bundle of policies, and it's open for debate. We can discuss it. But for instance, according to my own research, I would say part of school, and it's not only it's based on, for instance, the World Bank and OECD had in 2011 developed something called school autonomy and accountability, but also, so that term is everywhere. And based on that, I developed that. So school autonomy includes school choice. It includes incentives for non-state providers to open schools. In other words, like privatization, per capita financing, because school-based management is part of it, school boards for demand side accountability, the idea that schools should develop their own plans and their own profiles, make them public, and also professionalization of school management. Usually it starts with professionalization of school management. And if you look at donors and projects over the last 20, 30, 40 years, you see that there was a period, and the Word database also shows that, a period of intense training of school principals, because that was a condition for school-based management. And then you can also see a renewed interest in school boards, and donors again supported the idea of having school boards that basically control the principal in terms of school-based management. It does not happen in reality, but this was the idea, that was the theory behind it. And on the right-hand side, you also see a bundle of policies, and the bundle of policies is the idea to have clear standards and measure those standards. And that coincided with the move, or reinforced the move from inputs to outcomes regulation, by having like a standardized curriculum, by having standardized tests, by having and then incentives to reward those that are doing well and help those that are not doing well. That was the whole, so there's a whole theory of change. Now, the theory of change is different, and that's my point, in OECD countries or advanced economies than in countries that, when you look at the VERT database, implemented similar kinds of reforms, but I would say for different reasons, for different realities, for different reasons. Even though it looks like an accountability reform, it looks like a decentralization reform, but they had their own local or national reasons that not always are identical. And this is, again, another way to look at the bundle of policies. And very often in policy studies, we only look at one policy rather than on reform package. And I'm trying to, encourage that kind of scholarship where we look at how, in a more systemic manner, where policies are linked together and they build together in a combination, they do something. Alone, they don't do much, but in combination, they're supposed to trigger change and sustain change. There's also scholarship in policy studies on policy instruments, and we don't look into that enough in education, I think. In public policy studies, that's a big deal, to talk about what instruments do government use to induce change. And there are many, many, but the 5 bigger categories is governance by legislation. And this is what the WORD database is measuring. Government by laws and amendments and decrees and etc., but also governance by budgeting. And this would include, financial incentives for reforms. And I think that's the main instrument, actually, of donors. It's giving financial incentives for reforms. Then governance by persuasion, and that was big during the COVID times. Governance by other kinds of incentives and contracts arrangement, and that was the whole idea. Also, the contractual arrangement, the move towards outcomes orientation. And finally, and this is something that really became big as part of the SAVA reform, in performance measurement. And it was so important that, political scientists like Le Gallès says that this instrument of governance has overtaken other forms of governance. It has become so important. So having, that, after that brief introduction, let me now move into looking at the trends, but with a special focus at national encounters of the trend from a qualitative case study perspective. This is the wonderful WORD database, and Dr. Kijima, Professor Kijima, talked about it. And what it really does, it shows changes over time. I have a bit an issue to interpret the decline part, because what it really measures is new legislation that is being issued. So it is, the WORD database is very good in explaining adoption of reform, but maybe something else is needed to also look at decline, because it could also mean the decline curve that you see, that it means that it's saturated, that it has been adopted. Most countries adopted SAVA, school autonomy with accountability. That's why they didn't have to bring new legislation. But still, we need to understand what happened in the third after 2008. Why is there suddenly so few reforms? That's, for me, still a mystery. And I know we had this discussion at Stanford, and it will be so interesting to collaboratively look into it together with Trisha Bromley and Ria and their associates to understand what is going on. But what this WORD database definitely shows is the era of heightened reform activity. As I said, I would call it SAVA, others would call it neoliberal reforms between 1988 and 2008. This is very clear. And if you break it down, you can see, and the 2 doctoral students that Ria Kijima mentioned, Keiho Uno and Ayumu Yagi, they could show that OECD countries are even more active than non-OECD countries. They are really big in turning out legislative documents in terms of reform. So let's look at what's interesting to me, what I want to talk about now and point out is the period before 1988. What triggered those changes that we can see that happened? And this is really a global trend, and a global trend that is so clear in the WEIRD database. And we looked in the 10 case studies and it confirmed it. It was really a period of education expansion before 1988 globally. In OECD countries, it was having more and more students. So this is the average number of years of schooling. It was an expansion of educational attainment, which means more and people go longer to school. So there was an expansion of compulsory education in many countries. In China, it was from 6 to 9 years. In many other countries, it was from 9 to 11 years or from 9 to 12 years. So it was an expansion of the duration of schooling, but also of the people entering schooling, more women. But then with the Salamanca Agreement, then later on, this is not in this period, but there was an awareness that rural areas, hard to reach areas, there was an education expansion, especially in the global south after the post-colonial period, in the post-colonial period after the 1960s, where many countries gained independence from colonial empires. So you can see on the right side that this was really a global trend with different entry levels because of colonialism, because of dependence, but it was a global trend. So what happened with that global trend is the challenge for governments to offer schooling. There was a high demand, among others also because of the economies. There was a labor market needs, and that was OECD's argument, and there was also World Bank's interest to strengthen economic growth and prosperity. So there were needs at that level, and UNESCO's line was always human rights oriented. It was always individual rights oriented. So international organizations, for totally different reasons, supported that trend. So they supported it. They made agreements with 1990 as an example, but even before that, they supported it as advisors also. So this, at that time of educational expansion, of course, as we would expect, educational spending went up as a percentage of the GDP, but also as a commitment in terms of public expenditure. The reaction of governments was decentralization. We now call it school autonomy. That was the beginning of school autonomy. And many countries, in order to even fulfill that plan, they relied on counties, on districts to decentralize because they decentralized finance, for instance, cities, they have a fiscal basis to support schooling. The central government does not need to do that. Because they did that, they also had to give more rights and more to the county level and the province level and district level. In China, they had a dual really interesting development. In 1985, and then it went into effect in 86, they issued the expansion of compulsory education from 6 to 9 years. But before, they had, again, because they developed a model where they would select specific provinces and counties as examples of excellence, where then others would learn after them and emulate them. So it's, for me, an interesting case of policy transfer, actually. But this is the beginning, actually, of decentralization, which then later on became school autonomy. And as a result, it really worked in terms of money spending. This is a World Bank study of Gradstein, 2004-23, that they managed to keep the funding in line. I am getting the sign that I should hurry up. So let me just go and the second phase, so after the school autonomy, and this is a global trend, once you decentralize as a government, you get big inequity issues and you get big quality issues because some cannot hold up to the standard. So what happened after the government decentralized and delegated power and decision-making authority, it re-centered. And it started to do standard setting by means of curricula, by standardized tests, by having an eye on equity issues. So the second phase is a reaction to the first phase. And that is really important to keep the temporal dimension in mind. So when you look at that, let me skip that. So when you look, skip that too, it was first school autonomy and then afterwards, in a re-centralized mode, it was accountability. And this shows also when you look at the database, WIRD database, that there was a shift into accountability in terms of changes. And this is an example from the WIRD database. This is what the two doctoral students, your names is being circulated a lot, Ayumu and Kohei-san looked into. The word accountability almost did not even exist. When you look at the WIRD database, they looked for accountability and accountable. And prior to the, 1990s, that's where it started to emerge. It was not even a concept that was known or discussed. Whereas, and then autonomy, of course, in that reform page really surges. Other examples of country-specific responses to that from, this is an example from Iceland that I showed, and there are three things that, there's one pattern that we found in all the 10 case studies that were produced in this class in Kobe, but also 2 case studies I did before with colleagues in Iceland and in Switzerland. What the WIRD database shows is trends over time. What qualitative comparative education shows, or national encounters shows, the timing. It's a big difference between time and timing. At what particular moment are governments receptive to change? At what particular moment in their policy context do they adopt policies related to school-based management, to decentralization, etc. What we found across the board is it is usually shortly before, during, and after a change. And this is what we just discussed yesterday in the class. Kobe and the Myanmar group said that very beautifully. And before the change, there is a political science literature, because government do not want to, especially when they know that they are not elected, they want to have many changes before they leave. Primarily because to have a lasting impact, but also because they don't want to be blamed in retrospect. But then also during changes in government, because there is a switch handover, and after changes. And we were able to, and after changes, because they made promises for party programs and government action programs during the things. So this is an example of Ethiopia, where for the longest time during the socialist regime, there was no adoption happening, but then in legislative changes started in the early 1990s. Same with Bangladesh. There was a proliferation of changes in 1990. There were student protests, there were reactions, and you can see that there were 2 areas of change. These are all timing issues. And to wrap up my presentation, when we look at the WIRD databases, what the WIRD database helps us to explain is the time period and when things happened. We can look more into depth using the WIRD data to look at sequence, in which sequence do they happen, because there's a timeline associated. But we need to have case studies in order to look at timing of reform, because that requires a national perspective and an understanding of the policy context. What is not covered yet here and in this presentation, but we are working on it in other ones, is about institutionalization. And that's, I think, for donors especially interesting, because what travels is not necessarily what sticks or what is being funded. What has stayed in place after a while, the lifespan of a policy, is it short-lived? Does it stay? Is it sustained? The age, how does it change over time? All these are important aspects of policies that measure the institutionalization or the enactment of reform. But the world data definitely focus on the adoption, the left side of the reform, which is a very important gift to our community. Thank you very much. And I hope I'm not too much over time, but I think I am. So let me give the floor now to Arushi, to Keiji Sensei, to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Geeta and Ray, for such a fantastic presentation on such immense work that has gotten done, both in collecting global data, but also then starting to analyze more in-depth country contexts. We have lots and lots of questions, and I will not be able to cover all of them, but we are seeing a little bit of a trend in really trying to analyze the global versus local side of things. So we have several questions about this influence and trends within the global South itself. So Rishit Sen from University of British Columbia, Sumaira Hassan from University of Dhaka, Sergey Londar, Borin Kun from Cambodia have all asked some variation of this question. I am going to simplify and summarize some of these questions here. And Geeta and Rhea, please, both of you feel free to answer these. To what extent do you see influence from local intellectuals in education reforms in the Global South, in the education reform process itself? Do you see any differences and patterns with this in the Global North versus the Global South? And along with that, how do you believe countries from the Global North can learn from the Global South, and Global South can learn from Global North on how the reform process itself happens and which actors influence what needs to actually happen with the education reform? So over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for those wonderful questions. I'll take the first one, and I think that question on the local intellectuals is a really important one. And I think when we think about reform, enactment, and articulation, we want to see who is speaking and who is articulating these reforms and who's part of that discussion. Now, one of the limitations in our database is that these are reforms that countries work in collaboration with international organizations. So the statements that they say with regards to reform initiatives and articulation come from the government. And we don't see much of that specification as to where those reforms are coming from and who's been part of that conversation. So it's an area for further research, but it's a really important one, partly because we can speculate, given what we know already, that these local intellectuals, local, more autonomous voices and more localized ideas are quite reflected in the way that reforms are developed more in recent years, in recent decades. So we see some of that trend happening, and we could probably speculate that that is currently happening based on what we are finding in terms of the decline in World Bank, perhaps influence, right? Or World Bank's articulation reforms might be different from the way that perhaps maybe these non-government organizations are playing a role. So I can only speculate. We don't have any findings yet, but it's a really important thing that I think we need to keep in mind.
Maybe just two quick questions as a follow-up to Ria's points. We tried in the Word database to identify in the case studies which reforms were triggered by donor influence and which ones were government induced reforms. And you can do that when you do at qualitative studies. And I know, for instance, just the Ethiopian example comes to mind. So for instance, the last peak was triggered by World Bank reforms because the World Bank developed, you know, a multi-year strategy plan for Ethiopia. And I know the ADB has that as part of their design. They differentiate between project funding and policy tranche. So sometimes the money only flows once you have implemented policy changes. So there are ways, and I hope like the Word database that we can get this also feed it with data or compare it with data from international donors. That would be really wonderful to see what is really donor driven, what is government, and where do they converge, those two trends. The second one, this is actually GPE's very good, Global Partnership for Education. They are funding KIX exactly for strengthening the local expertise and the peer exchange between local experts, but also as a feedback from what is happening at the national level to feed it back to the international level. And I really believe in that KIX project. I think it's one of the best projects that I've seen. And I think it's also working well to really strengthen this local policy expertise.
Thank you, Geeta and Ray. And please feel free to answer some of the questions, especially regarding the specificity of the data within the database in the chat message as well. I will pass the floor to Dr. Ogawa to take some questions from the audience in the room now.
Okay, thank you so much. So anybody who want to ask questions? Okay, please. I want to correct some questions. Please mention your name, introduce yourself, your name and the institution and which country you come from.
Thank you so much, Ogawa Sensei. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Geeta Sensei. Thank you so much for your intriguing presentation. And also thank you so much, Kizima Sensei, for your intriguing presentation. So my name is Rakibul Hassan. I'm a first-year master's student under the supervision of Ogawa Sensei, and I'm from Bangladesh. So thanks to Geeta Sensei, we had analyzed the data for Bangladesh and Singapore, and we find out that if we categorize the reforms into 9 categories that the overbase study had done. So the trend, for example, you showed that there is a decrease in the reforms since maybe 1992 to 2008. But when we categorize the reforms, actually the trend actually changes. For example, in the case of Bangladesh, we have like education sector plan that actually covers everything, all the 9 components of the overbase study. So one big reform actually covering everything now. So, but in the 1990s, there was like separate reforms, but those could be covered in only one reform. So that could be one of the reasons behind this kind of trends. So are you considering this kind of things in your study? And also for some of the things, I think in the constitutions and also the acts. So you also consider the constitution and acts as the reform. So I would like to know about those things, whether those should be considered as reform or constitution or acts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, please? I want to correct more. And please make question to be short. Okay, please. You don't have to say thank you. Just introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is Mubin Khan Afridi. I am from Bangladesh, and I am under first-year master student under Dr. KIX Yoga, and I also did work on Bangladesh and Singapore. And based on that paper, I would love to know why you selected those 9 particular policy areas to focus to the Bromley paper. Yes, Overbay paper. So that's my question.
Thank you. Anybody, please raise a hand. I will give you the microphone. Nobody? If not, okay. Geeta Sensei, and then Kijima Sensei, could you respond?
think in the interest of time, I think these are weird questions that Ria should address if it's fine with you, like the 9, how you found the 9. I found it interesting, the point that the first speaker made on how governments have changed their approach to issuing reforms. Now the governments themselves do fundamental packages. So, and then this counts only as one, even though we used to do like 8 or 9 different things. So that's policy. We were in policy studies, Tosun and Howlett, they call that policy styles. There are different national policy styles that, of course, we cannot take into account when we look at global trends.
Right.
But Ria, you should maybe address.
Sure. I'll do my best to answer your question. So when we look at these reforms, some of these reforms are bigger packages. So we might see a larger reform with multiple components of reform underneath some of these larger packages of reform. So what we have done is we parsed out those separately within the larger package of reform. So I think that might be one of the ways in which we've been capturing these elements of reform. I haven't looked very closely to the case of Bangladesh, so it's hard for me to assess what we might observe specifically in that country. But based on what I'm hearing is that perhaps in certain countries, these reforms have increased. But at the global, larger scale, we see some of those reforms at an aggregate decrease over time. So we certainly see some outliers and we see some trends that are more at that average. But what we have found in our research is really at that aggregate level, right? For all countries, for all the reforms that we see over time, what do we notice, right? And I think some of the questions related to that is, well, how do we think about these dip? Is it because of the reports that we are gathering? Maybe there's been just lack of resource, right? Lack of documents that are available to us. So that's something that we're looking in, vamping up our research and addressing more and finding more reports along the way. In terms of the 9 policy focus, I'm trying to remember what those 9 policies are. So maybe perhaps we can talk a little bit offline or perhaps maybe in the chat box. So I'll respond to that question more specifically.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kijima Sensei and Gita Sensei, for very informative and stimulative keynote speech. So I want to move on to the next part, which is the panel discussions. The panel discussions, the topic is objective challenges and encountering with global reform packages. Here, we have invited 5 experts, and they are from the academia, and they are also from the country levels, the government, and also international organizations. So the purpose of this panel discussion is that in the program, page 1, we mentioned that sort of 3 questions. The first question, which we'd like to cover. The first question is that which features of school autonomy with accountability are actively promoted and are funded by development partners? Second question is that did the development partners' reform priorities change over the time? Number 3 is comparing reforms priorities of development partners. Are there similarities and differences? So based on the keynote speech, and we have also 3 sort of questions. Then the panelists I'd like to introduce. So we just want to go by the programs. At first, I want to introduce you Professor Yume Yamaguchi, who is currently a director of the United Nations University Institute of Advanced Study Sustainabilities. Her research field is her field of specialization includes international education development and cooperation, ICT in education, education policy, science and technologies, science and technology policy, and application of technology in World Heritage Site preservations. She also served as a member of the International Advisory Board of the UNESCO flagship program, Futures of Education. And in the program, it didn't mention that she's a emeritus professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. So she has both the academia and the international organizations. So could you maybe start with like 3 minutes regarding you don't have to respond everything, but if you can cover 1 or 2, that would be nice.
Thank you. Thank you very much, the chair, the Professor Ogawa, and I am very happy to be here for several reasons, because this is a very important, very timely topic that we talk about the trend of the reform with the data. Because I think many of us suffer from the inefficient data when we talk about the future of the educational reform. So I really enjoyed Professor Kijima's the brilliant the presentation where which those data will be available to all of our researchers and government people. This is the huge difference I can see that it is going to make a difference. And second of all, it's almost like coming back academic home with Professor Gita, who was my doctoral advisor, and Professor Ogawa. We were the colleagues of the first cohort of the graduate of the Professor Gita. So I felt like I am back in a doctoral seminar given by the Professor Gita. And also, I'd like to mention Professor Gita talked about the READ project in Mongolia. I am, in fact, the living evidence of having seen the impact of the READ project, where I visited most of the 21 provinces in Mongolia. Schools was flooded with books, and teachers had a huge impact of becoming more confident and more autonomous, because that project really taught the teachers it is okay to be innovative. So I think we can talk more about this if the time allows. Okay, now for my intervention, I'd like to quickly lay out the 2 data to show the reality where we are located in educational reform. The current learning, the crisis, that actually shows that we all know that providing the access merely does not guarantee the quality of learning. And the most recent report, quite shocking report, the State of Global Learning Poverty by the World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF 2022 reveals, after the pandemic, 70% of 10-year-old are unable to understand the written text. Either they're in school or they're out of school. Okay, this is an increase by 1/3 after the pandemic. So this is the reality that we are facing. And second of all, as an expert of the ICT in education, I have to mention that we have to admit the exponential development of AI is definitely impacting the fundamental question to our educational reform. That is, what should we teach the children or the adult when, quote, trained AI machine perform much better than the top 10% of the human performers in the most of the standardized tests, including bar exams, university entrance exams. That's the data by the OpenAI 2023. And also adult literacy test. That's the data supported by the OECD 2023. So these are the reality we are facing. So given this context, our institute, we argue that the school system or the school reform should really rethink the parameters of quality of education when learning shall continue beyond the school years, right? With and for the community, with lifelong learning, of course. And number 2, whether learning is relevant to the global questions, the global issues, so that learning gain of the individuals can drive learners' action toward the more sustainable society. Okay, so having said that, we don't want to be too pessimistic, right? So I'd like to lay out a bit of the initiatives that we have, really promoting the local educational reform. There was a question whether those reform are donor influenced or government influenced. We have a very good example of the global network, the code, the regional centers for expertise on ESD, Education for Sustainable Development. So we work a lot with the local government. So these are the examples of the government informed or government influenced the reform taking place in the community. And in fact, we have 190 the regional centers for the expertise on ESD, which is development partners in 62 different countries in 5 continents. And this is actually the innovative platform and the living laboratory. We call it the living laboratory to facilitate really the transformative education and interlinkaging the section of the government. Okay, so out of 478 projects in the last 5 years, more than half had involved the both primary and secondary schools, working with the community, but also over the 190, the project involved higher education. So this means that there is a lot of a defined role of the higher education who can really impact on the educational reform infused by local government, the policies. Okay, and second, quickly, another initiative is the presentation mentioned about how the reform takes place in the different parts of the world, and whether it's developing country or developed country. What we promote right now is really to work with the multiple government so that they can influence each other to induce the action-oriented reform. So, for example, recently we actually building the next generation to support the local climate action. The Korean government and Thai government, they work together really to train the youth through now we are so much into this ideathon, the style, the activities. This means from through this training, actually the youth group, they produce the real the project which will be bought by the local government. Okay, and this is really to promote the youth and climate action in the community. So it has become the part of local government policies, but also that has been influenced to the school reforms, both in primary and secondary levels. And just last, the point, as a United Nations University, we produce a lot of policy-oriented research. The one thing I'd like to mention is the very much of the importance of including the climate displaced population into the reform. Okay, because as you have seen, so many different parts of the world, it's either it's climate related or, of course, the conflict related. There is an increasing number of the displaced population. So who should be accountable in how it should be put into the part of the future reform, not only at the school, but at the community level. So the UNESCO and the United Nations University, we have been working together through the case studies in Latin America, in Asia, and Africa. And it is very interesting. We have seen so many similarities of the population, displaced population, when they were talking about the reform of the education. So maybe during the discussion period, I may be able to share some more the cases that we are engaged in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yamaguchi-sensei. Next panelist, I want to invite Kuroda-sensei. Professor Kazuo Kuroda is currently a professor and the former dean of the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies at Waseda University. He is the the currently a Vice President of the Comparative International Education Societies. じゃあ、黒田先生、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Professor Ogawa. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. I have to echo actually what Yume sensei just said, I think, because I feel like actually being a PhD student back to 1990s, because I first met actually Gita sensei actually for the first time, introduced by Ogawa-san as a doctoral student of Gita sensei in the that time. So I feel like that. And then also Kijima sensei, I'm so impressed actually by your presentations. And then Kijima sensei, you I met, I think you, when you were undergraduate student. I feel really old. Actually, you became such a wonderful researcher now. And then, but anyway, because I prepared actually some of my comments today. I mean, for about Japan as a vital donor for the education priority setting. But I was so much inspired and impressed actually by the two presentations. I just changed my plan. And then I'd like to comment on the actually your presentations with actually my interest on the global governance of education, because Kijima sensei mentioned that the transformation of the influences of the international organizations like the World Bank and OECD on the educational reforms, and then found, I think, in this great database. And then also Gita sensei mentioned or talked about this global script and global reforms, and then theory of change. And then I'm really actually wondered how this theory of change happened or influenced actually by the global governance. Of course, global governance is not the same meaning of the international organizations. And I, in my recent paper, I categorize actually the global governance into 5. And then for example, the historical global governance is a kind of legal approach, the international law, universal or international principle, the international global universal declaration of human rights, or recent case is the CRPD, the Convention on the Right of the Persons with Disabilities, really had a great influences on the each ratified countries' policy reforms on the education for inclusions, inclusive to promote inclusive educations, and so on. But this is a very conventional. But in the later, the international organizations and also some other agents of the international society actually started to influence each country's policy reforms through presenting the concept or kind of compiling the reports, like a Doro report had great influences on the many member countries of UNESCO's, reforms on educations, and then also learning, lifelong learning concept proposed, or recurrent education proposed by the OECD, and many actually other or 21st century skills. That's not actually by the international organizations, but that's actually really influential on the many different reforms of the countries. And then also third is a conference agreement approach. It's like a Jomtien, or older than that, I think, Addis Ababa Plan, or, or MDGs, SDGs, all actually these had a great influences. This is not a legally binding, actually, concept, but it certainly influenced the reforms of the educations in the many different countries. And then, as Kijima sensei, Gita sensei mentioned, I think the financial approach, the World Bank, GPE, of course, the World Bank was a very influential donor in the past for the educational reforms. But recently, the GPE, and then also arising the education cannot wait, actually, this kind of financial mechanism of the global society also is started to has great influence on the education reforms of the countries. And then lastly, the very, very fast emerging the indicator approach of the the PISA, SACMEC, many actually this kind of the indicator type of the global governance has or actually unlegitimated indicator type of approach is I think university global ranking that actually really is influencing on the respective countries' educational reforms. So how these global governance means is influencing on the respective countries in the history of the education reforms of the different countries. I really want to investigate that, I think, with this great database that Kijima Sensei and the team created. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kuroda Sensei. So I want to introduce next panelist, who is the Excellency Dr. Sam Sidet D. He's joining us online. So Dr. Sidet is the currently the Secretary General of the National Committee for Lifelong Learnings, and he's also a Deputy Director General for Education in the Ministry of Education, Youth, and Sports, Cambodia. Dr. Sidet is the have rich experience in also international organizations like UNESCO and ADBs, and he's also have another hat that he is the founding dean of education, Faculty of Education in the Royal University of Phnom Penh. And I want to highlight that the Excellency Sidet is a graduate of Hiroshima University. Yeah, thank you. Please, Excellency.
Thank you, Ogawa, Professor Ogawa, for the kind introduction. I'm very delighted to be part of this symposium. I just would like to open a quick window about Cambodia due to 3-minute time allowance. Related to reform that we mentioned earlier, Cambodia has gone through a journey since the 1990s, Jomtien, Education for All. Up until now, the sustainable development and lifelong learning, that's what we are moving. The reform that we've gone through, it can be a serious reform and less serious reform. And the serious reform that we did recently is on examination reform, and to ensure no cheating, and those who work hard, those who learn hard, and has to be reflected in the result of the exam, the high school exam. The current reform that has been bombarding and based on political commitment as well as financial commitment is on the school-based reform. The minister is holding a flagship and to ensure that the school autonomy is linked with accountability. So we adjusted the old name of the school support committee into the school management committee. That means that not only to give resources for school construction and environment improvement, but also to come to joint decision making. The commune chief, the parent representative, community representative, together with the school management team to set up a school management committee to ensure accountability in the finance, in staffing, in teaching and learning, as well as the administration to ensure school effectiveness. The new words right now and the ministry is carrying is setting the standards, the school, primary school standards, and lower secondary school standard, upper secondary school standard. Now we are moving to setting up the teacher education institution standard to ensure that they are moving by the rule and to ensure the budget commitment, to ensure the teamwork, and to ensure the joint effort by the ministry as well as the university for the school. So now we are talking about putting things together, the ministry, the teacher education institution, as well as the university to ensure that the public school system deliver quality and relevant education, that participation from the community has been enhanced and has been improved. Like what the previous speakers mentioned, we have been adjusting our reform policy with the global trends. UNESCO came in with the UNICEF in the early 1990s, the Jomtien Declaration, the Education for All, and then World Bank and GPE and ADB has been strong in implementing in improving the quality of secondary schools, and to make sure that the secondary school STEM subject will be linked to university, because the labor market need more junior engineers and middle skill engineer under the framework of making Cambodia become the upper middle income country by 2030 and to be a high income country by 2050. So under that political agenda, education reform has been so far to ensure the quality and relevant to make the human capital ready for the economy enhancement. I have to stop here due to the time, and I will be waiting and joining further discussion. Thank you, Professor Ogawa.
Thank you so much, Shidesh Sensei. Then I want to invite Dr. Harry Patorinos, who is DC time 11 p.m. So sorry, so late. So I think that all of us know Harry very well. Dr. Harry Patorinos is currently a senior advisor of education at World Bank headquarters. And Harry's specialization is economics of education, especially school-based management, demand-side financing, and public-private partnerships. Thank you so much, Harry, for joining us.
Thank you, KG. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I think people mentioned the World Bank already, but I'll just say two things about us. One, the World Bank's the largest financier of education in developing countries and working to help them reach the SDG 4 goals. If I had to summarize what our main initiative is, I would say it's ending learning poverty. Related to the subject of the conference, a few remarks. One, just to remind everyone, we don't really need the reminding, but education has tremendous benefits in terms of economic development, reduction of poverty, but also social and transformational, intergenerational benefits that we all know about. And at the same time, because of this realization, countries are devoting significant portions of their resources to the financing of their education systems, 3 to 5% of GDP, 10 to 15% of public expenditures. But we're not seeing the results yet that we aspire to. We're not seeing learning outcomes increase. In fact, learning outcomes had stagnated and in many parts of the world started to decline even before the COVID-19 pandemic and the school closures. So there was already a learning crisis that has been exacerbated by the recent crises, and the crises continue as we all know. So the spending, despite the tremendous increase in spending, the tremendous access to education, we're going to see in our lifetimes convergence in at least years of schooling and enrollment rates, but we're not seeing significant improvements in learning outcomes. So something is failing. And one hypothesis is that it's the service delivery that's failing. And this brings us to some of the topics that were discussed today: governance, information, accountability, and so on. All those efforts were to try to improve service delivery, which would then lead to improvements in learning outcomes along the way. So the governance reforms are enacted. In terms of donor and my experience with school accountability and autonomy, in fact, we refer to school autonomy, accountability, and assessment, because without any information, it's hard to improve. You really can't improve what you don't measure. So assessment goes with autonomy and accountability for us. And our entry into this was what I would call the systems approach, which attempted to bring together the different elements of what makes a good education system, and using information from high-performing countries, we developed a framework for looking at what you needed to do if you were interested in improving the management of your schools, for example, what are some of the characteristics of well-performing systems based on the evidence that exists? That has developed over time from an analysis of policy intents and goals, reforms, I guess it would be called, to looking at actual impact of projects that are implemented in country by national authorities, by national experts, and measured along the terms of those goals. So a project that a government designs, implements, and finances. It is their resources, their money. So we're learning today a lot more about what improves learning outcomes, and in some cases it is related to aspects of the school autonomy, accountability. But one thing that is absolutely clear is a lack of information prevents any good analysis, decision-making, and without good information, it's hard to really design anything that's worthwhile. So the database on what works has grown. We have a global advisory group that measures this in all of the elements, and I would say the focus has been on what improves learning outcomes in the early years, especially reading. And many of these interventions were tried in countries with, again, national organizations, whether they were NGOs or research organizations. And now many of those have been scaled to government delivery, and we are seeing some success. So going forward, we hope to see more in terms of creating evidence in countries and then using that evidence to design better programs. In the interest of time, I'll leave it at that and hand back to you, Keiichi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Patorinos. Thank you. It's like 11 p.m. Washington time. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I want to move on to the next, which is the open discussions. So any questions that if you have, maybe here in the room, Kobe University, if you have any questions, please raise a hand. No questions? Okay, so one question from online. Uno-kun, can you read?
Yes, the question from online, from Sheldon May, Hiroshima University. What do you think will be the impact of AI utilization on policy reform trends in AI area? And for example, will it contribute to policy reforms in developing countries while enhancing the capacity of policymakers? Has your team already added, or do you plan to develop any impact indicators related to AI in policy reforms into the RIA database? Those are questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Anybody from the here? No? Okay, so any panelists, could you respond for this? Not sure, but. Ah, そっか、木島先生ありました。あ、how about 宇野くん、Dr. Kishima?
Also, the impact of AI utilization on policy reform trends in AI era. So, the relationship between policies and AI utilizations in developing countries.
いいですか？はい、じゃあ、山口先生。
So I'm not sure about this AI impact on database creation now, but what I can see as a trend, current trend, the AI, the utilization we have a very positive impact in dealing with the data. Okay, but at the same time, the current trend in international arena community is the understanding the AI governance when dealing with the data and AI ethics in dealing with the data. So, because the utilization of the AI now, it is really the hot discussion and taking place both in developing countries and developed the countries. But unfortunately, there is not the global platform to share and discuss more openly. So one of the new initiatives the UN is trying to implement right now is there is every July we have a high-level political forum on SDGs. And there is a higher education, the sustainability initiatives where the 800 university get together and to discuss the new trend or the role of higher education. So this discussion of the utilization of the AI in the educational policy or the reform, now the role of higher education has become more and more important. Because we are, the higher education is the place that we can really train the expert on AI or the expert on the user of the data to influence the policy, not only the education policy, but the government, the policy. Because definitely, as you know, the education policy really has to be the part of the national, the overall national the policies, and utilization of AI is the same. Okay, so I am very happy to share with this higher education the sustainability initiatives and where we are adding the new expert group on AI and reform of higher education. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Is this another question? Okay, please.
So another question from online. Can and should lessons be learned from other countries? From which countries? And who are the countries that national government use the draw lessons for their own reform? This is the question. Okay. Also, from the radical goal, the Deakin University, trying to emulate high-performing systems to improve outcomes elsewhere may be the key reasons for the failure of reforms. That is the question.
Thank you. Anybody from the floor? No? I wonder, anybody can respond for this? Panelist?
Maybe there are much better actually panelists actually in the online, but one time, once upon a time, actually, OECD actually published reports on the strong performers, trying to actually study about how the PISA strong performers, created, I think, that high performance. And then I think it's a very good actually practice actually to draw the implications actually for other member countries. I think at that time actually specifically they try to make implications for the American somehow actually US educational reforms. So that's good. I think maybe if it is a parallelly actually conducting actually that kind of but at the same time, if there is a kind of power relations actually between the country of the reform and then also the country of which is trying to learn actually the reform experiences, and then sometimes actually some countries really want to export their educational models to other countries, and then with maybe some aid and then financial support, and then that's not sometimes actually appropriately integrated in the country. So I think it is we need to have some more kind of objective considerations about how the context of this learning from other countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Regarding those questions, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Professor Ogawa. I think there's what Kurada Sensei just mentioned. There's a lot of lesson learned, best practices from neighboring countries, as well as a lot of international perspective ideas. There's a lot of great ideas has come and by policymakers and scholars, and the policy document has been written. The current issue now for Cambodia as well as the other developing country is to challenge with the local school cultures. You know, the school, they have their own operation cultures there. And when we inject new ideas, we inject new standards into ensuring accountability, ensuring to give more autonomy for them to engage to the result, you know, based on learning achievement of the students. And there are some issues that they find it difficult to adapt to, and it's always takes some time that the school normally requests, and then they ask us to build more capacity for them and to support and incentivize them for the success they are making. Thank you, Professor Ogawa.
Thank you so much, Excellency. So it's already past, like 10 minutes past. So I'd like to close the session. So before that, I wonder, our co-organizers, Dr. Tawe, would you like to say a few words before we close this session?
Thank you, everyone, for joining in today. I know we went over time, but there was such fantastic discussion throughout this session. I would invite everyone to fill out our post-event survey. That way we will be able to get more information on the things that you liked about this event, but also what we could be including in future events. So the link for the survey will be shared in the chat very soon. Please follow KIX EMAP Hub on all of the social media so you can get more information about future events. And also, I look forward to having you join in on all the future events. Thank you very much. The highlights for this event and the recordings will be shared with everyone who registered for the event as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tawe. I want to thank for the all the partners that which made this happened very successfully. So many participants that we had, and I really want to big thanks to Professor Gita Sena-Kamsi, really put us together for this. And after this, we will have a sort of group photos, and we will have receptions. So everybody online, so you are welcome to join us our reception through Zoom. It's a sort of joke, but thank you so much indeed.